In the early 1940s, the United States was going through its Industrial Revolution. So coal was being burned at a very rapid rate in order to further our society, causing massive amounts of air pollution. Today, China is facing some of the same struggles. I'm a civil engineering student here at Penn State, and last summer I was granted the opportunity to travel to China to view some of their alternative energy projects that are going on currently. I witnessed the massive hydro project of the Three Gorges Dam, which generates a massive amount of electricity. And I also visited a city that ran entirely on its own self-generated power. So clearly China is attempting to do something to find a new source of alternative energy and get rid of the pollution in their skies. So I believe that air pollution due to the burning of fossil fuels can easily be remedied by the continued and increased use of nuclear power. So today, I would like to walk you through just the basic function of nuclear power and how it works, and then compare the efficiency, the amount of pollution in the air caused by nuclear power versus coal, and the health effects if nuclear power were to replace coal. So the only logical place to start is how nuclear power works. So nuclear power, essentially the key behind it is uranium. Uranium is found naturally on the Earth and it decays naturally, breaking bonds and releasing energy. So this uranium is contained and condensed into a rod and then placed in a water bath so that all of the energy given off, which is given off as heat, will heat the water, cause steam to rise, and then flow through a generator, causing electricity to be made, which is completely a natural process as opposed to the burning of fossil fuels, which creates massive amounts of air pollution and PM 2.5 particles in the air. So now that we know a little bit about how nuclear power works, let's look into China's future policy on alternative energy. So in this graph from the World Nuclear Association, you can see that China has been using wind and hydropower excessively, and that their alternate sources of energy, they prefer those, which they haven't really stepped into the solar and nuclear markets of alternative energy. And what's good about nuclear power is that really all you don't need high wind speeds, you don't need a massive amount of water falling through a turbine, you just need a water reservoir, and to purchase uranium to cause the heat reaction to go off. So as you can see, China's hydro and wind power have somewhat became stagnant in their rate, and they haven't really delved into solar and nuclear power. So they have a very open market for that sort of power. So now that we know China's future alternative energy policy, let's look into how cost-effective nuclear power is. Now, nuclear power, as you can see in this graph from the Energy Information Administration, is one of the cheapest, most cost-effective forms of producing power. Now, this is only behind solar photovoltaic power, which varies from point to point in its cost. So as you can see, nuclear power is one of the most cost efficient forms of alternative energy out there per unit of power. So now that we know how the cost compares in nuclear energy versus all other kinds of alternative sources, let's look into the amount of emissions caused by nuclear power. Now, nuclear power, as you can see, very low on the emission scale. You don't need to burn coal or burn gas, any sort of fossil fuels that emit harmful toxins into the air. It's essentially just a natural process that occurs with decaying uranium and steam. So, as you can see, the nuclear emissions, or toxic emissions due to nuclear power, are about an 80th of that of coal. So clearly it is a cleaner, more optimal solution than burning fossil fuels like gas and coal. So now that we know So now that we know about how many emissions nuclear power gives off relative to coal, let's look into the health effects. Now, some may say that nuclear power is not necessarily a safe form of energy, but this is just not true. This is a graph from NASA showing the millions of prevented deaths if nuclear power were to replace fossil fuels in the near coming years. Now, this graph is the projected prevented deaths in the millions. As you can see, South Asia is about 560,000 people would be spared from be spared from emissions due to burning fossil fuels if they were switched over to nuclear power. And almost 7 million people in the world would have a longer lifespan if nuclear power were to replace coal and gas and all other alternative sources of energy. And now that we know how nuclear power compares if it were to replace coal, let's look at just how safe the workplace is, because people are always very concerned about nuclear meltdowns, the effects it has on a certain radius outside of the power plant. So let's look at the amount of work-related accidents that have happened with producing alternative energy. Now, working at a nuclear power plant is one of the safest jobs you can have when concerning energy-related accidents. As you can see from this graph, there are very, very, very few deaths in the past 40 years. This graph is taken from the World Nuclear Association. It's just a poll of the energy-related accidents that have happened within the last 40 years. So as you can see, nuclear power is virtually zero, while gas and coal, the two most prevalent fossil fuels used in energy production, are pretty high. They're about 300 and 200 deaths per unit of power, respectively, over years average. And as you can see, hydropower is extremely high, which I guess could account for just many accidents that happen during construction and whatnot. Excuse me. So I've talked about how nuclear power works, how cost-efficient nuclear power is, the health effects, and also the amount of CO2 emissions released into the air concerning nuclear power versus coal. And I believe that in the years to come, that nuclear power could completely replace coal. It's a more viable option, and it's also a much cleaner, healthier option for all of humanity. I believe that with more progressions in alternative sources of energy, that eventually the Chinese people will be able to walk outside without a mask or a respirator due to prolonged exposure, and take a deep morning breath and thank alternative sources of energy for their blue skies. Thank you. Are there any questions?